friends. Today we are talking with Stephen James, author and teacher, and it's going to be so much fun. So let's hop into this interview. And if you're new here, be sure to hit the bell and subscribe. I love to chat about writing and publishing and do interviews with people in the publishing industry. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and your writing and your books for people who might not be familiar with you.
Sure. I started telling stories when I was actually a camp counselor. I don't know if you knew this or not, but I was working at a camp and basically the kids were jumping up and down on the bunks at night. And I was like, how am I going to get them to settle down? And so finally I was like, I'm just going to tell them a story. So I told them a story and bored them to sleep. And I was like, I'm good. And then I was like, wait a minute, I bored them to sleep. I don't know if that's good or not. So I would like go from cabin to cabin, boring the kids to sleep at night. And so I basically told stories that I'd heard growing up and from my uncle. And so then one night, the kids actually stayed awake and they're like, tell us another story. And so I did. And then I used up all those stories. So they're like, do you know any more stories? And I was like, I got to make one up. So that's when I made up my first story. So that was back a while ago. But anyway, when I was like 18 or 19, when that happened. And then I just kind of got into this idea of telling stories, right? So at my college, we started a storytelling club, and we would like go to the library, well, maybe the elementary schools and libraries, and then tell stories to kids. And so
Cool.
So yeah, and then eventually just I started to travel and tell stories, but then I got married and had some little kids, some little girls, and I was like, I don't want to be gone while they're growing up. I don't want to be traveling 300 days a year. So I'm gonna still tell stories, but I'll write them. And so that was back in, gosh, whatever. I started late 90s. I started writing for magazines, and then I just kept wanting to tell bigger and bigger stories. And finally, I started writing novels in about 2006. And I've done 17 novels over the years, and then about almost 40 other books over the years as well. And nonfiction and on writing and all those kind of fun things. Yeah. Mostly thrillers. Like I write suspense novels. So
awesome. Yes, I know I've read some of the Pond series and also your two that you have out. I believe you might have another writing one coming out, right? Like I've read your two that are out.
Story Trumps Structure is one of those that came out first, and then Troubleshooting Your Novel a couple years later. And I do have a new book on writing I'm working on, but I have a book on storytelling that actually will be helpful for writers. I think that comes out in August. It's called The Art of the Tale. So yeah, that you can pre-order it now, but The Art of the Tale, it was fun. I co-wrote it with a friend of mine who's one of the world's leading corporate speech writers. So like from my perspective as a storyteller and his as a speechwriter, how can you use stories to better communicate? So it was super interesting and fun for the most part, a lot of work, but it was good.
Right. Well, that is amazing. That's really cool. I'm excited to hear about those books. I'll put the information down below about the one that people can go and pre-order as well, so that if they can find it, then they can get it. So always fun, right? Here, which books of yours are you the most proud of? And I know this is like asking someone to pick a child, right? Because they're all of your favorites, right? But what would you like people to read the most if they were to start out with your books?
Well, the truth is, the Pawn series is really, there's 11 books in that series. The Pawn is a good place to start with that series. So that was my first published novel, and it was I think the story still holds up, even though it's been out since 2006 or so.
Wow.
If you wanted to start with a more recent one, there's a prequel called Every Wicked Man that's more recent, and it kind of leads up to it. I think that one won a number of awards, International Book Award for Best Suspense that year, and so that was a good one. Then the most recent book is Synapse. If you like sci-fi, try that. So yeah, it takes place 30 years in the future. And basically what led me to write it was like, I've always loved sci-fi stories and artificial intelligence stories and all that. And I thought, well, what about if machines have free will, consciousness, and the ability to make their own decisions and so on, self-awareness?
Yeah.
Well, what will they choose to believe? So the book kind of deals with artificial belief instead of artificial intelligence, which I'd never seen done before. And so yeah, it's a thriller, but it takes place 30 years from now. So if you tend to sci-fi, that would be one. It's a little philosophical too, because I always think sci-fi gives you that chance to sort of explore what does it mean to be human.
Right.
And Every Wicked Man is more suspense. Those two I really like. They're my most recent novels, and hopefully my novels keep getting better.
Right.
Hopefully.
Right. That's the thing a
Over
writer
the
always
years.
hopes for, right? But
I
yeah,
know,
you're
right?
fine. I'm sure with each book you've gotten better and better over time, because like, man, even with each edit of one book that I'm working on, it's like, man, well, that's better than the last edit. So yeah.
I hope so, but no, I mean, it's interesting. I did about 1 or 2 novels a year. Well, I have for the last
Wow.
like 17 years, and
Okay.
um, so it's hard to say like which one I'm most proud of, but those are good places to start if you're interested in
Okay.
reading. So yeah.
Perfect. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that. It's always good to hear from the author's mouth, like which ones they think that readers should start with.
Yeah.
So that's always fun. What made you want to be a writer? Was it kind of back when you started telling the stories to the camp kids, or what was the initial spark that kind of like, you know?
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, my uncle would tell us stories.
Mhm.
I fell in love with just imagination, creativity, stories, campfire stories, whatever, camp stories and so on. But then when I was in college, there came a day, I remember I was at this laundromat doing my clothes wash in between camp, weeks, whatever. And I remember just sitting there saying, I want to be a storyteller. And I wrote down in my journal, my life, I want to be a storyteller. And I didn't know what it would look like exactly, telling stories, orally or writing stories, but that was kind of the pivotal moment where I made that decision that this is the direction, the one things to go. And so over the years, I just kept wanting to tell bigger and bigger stories. And eventually it worked out. I went to the publisher that I was working with on some nonfiction books. This was
Oh,
back in 2005 or so. And I said, do I really have to write a whole manuscript before I can submit it? And they're like, well, send us 50 pages. We'll look at it. So I sent them 50 pages and they gave me a 3-book deal. And that was kind of how I started writing novels at that time.
nice. Okay. That's awesome. That's a great deal, right?
Well, everyone said, I mean, the truth is everyone's road to publishing novels is a little bit paved a little differently. And so by the time that I wrote that, people are like, well, you got a 3-book deal on 50 pages. Yes, but I'd already written more than 20 nonfiction books.
Wow.
And I'd written for over 80 different magazines and publications for
Yeah.
almost a decade. So I was pretty experienced as a writer. I mean, I'd been writing almost full time for almost a decade.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it's unusual, but it's not, it can happen basically. Publishers and editors, agents are looking for something to love. I mean, some people will say they're looking for a reason to say no, and I get that. I don't know. I know where you're coming from when you say that, but I mean, legitimately, they're looking for something where they start reading and they're like, I love this. I cannot put this down. And I want to read more. And so if you can write something that will do that,
Mhm.
really, I think it was the first chapter of The Pawn that sold me the 3-book deal. I
Nice.
think it was those 10 pages really.
Yeah, they're
And
very
people,
catchy.
oh, thanks for saying. But yeah, no. And then over time, most of the other books I sold were on proposals, and
Okay.
but that's just, everyone's different. Some people write a whole manuscript and they send it in and they sell it, or they don't sell it. And I know a lot of my friends have written, manuscripts at the beginning, and so sent them out and gotten dozens of rejections for it before they finally sell it. So it
Yep.
just varies. But my encouragement really is just tell an amazing story.
Hmm. Yep.
And because really that's what they're looking for, something fresh, just a great voice, something intriguing, a little different that they haven't seen before. And if you do that, you're going to move kind of to the top of the stack.
What are the top 5 books of all the books that you've read that you loved the most? Like your favorite 5 books?
Oh my goodness. Favorite 5? You mean nonfiction, like on writing, or fiction?
Yeah, it can be anything. Like anything you've read that like touched you and made you who you are. Just like the 5 books that are just like, oh yeah, those are my favorite books.
You had to ask something like this. Okay.
Right. Sorry.
I also asked which of my favorite that I wrote. I'm like, where are these questions coming from? Okay, so let's see. I don't know, 5 books that influenced me. So basically, there was one book I read a number of years ago called The Book of the Dun Cow, D-U-N.
Okay.
Wow. And it won the National Book Award maybe in 86 or so. Anyway, a while ago. But I read that and it really taught me to write tightly, like to write like every word matters in this book. And so that was influential, especially early on as I was writing. I really enjoyed that.
Cool.
As far as like a sort of a series of books that really was inspiring to my imagination, there's a series called the Singer Trilogy. Calvin Miller wrote back in the 70s, I think.
Okay.
That is just really interesting as far as like almost mythic, kind of a mythic retelling of some like the biblical narrative. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but it's very different, but very inspired my imagination.
Cool.
Then growing up, I mean, I've always loved Stephen King's stories, and so I can't really think of one particular one that's super impacted me, but his short stories I always enjoyed.
Oh, okay.
You know, so more than not that I don't enjoy his novels, but I've always sort of been gravitated toward, you know, short stories.
Right.
So those just 3 come to the top of my brain. I mean, there are so many hundreds of books I've loved over the years, and I don't know what else particularly comes to.
That's all right.
I read a book recently though that I really enjoyed. Stephanie Oak's book called The Sacred Lies of Minnow Bly. Was the name of it. So it's probably the best book I've read in the last couple of years.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So
cool.
I don't know that's my favorite ever, but it certainly is worth checking out if anyone's interested. Yeah.
Oh yes. So what does your typical writing day look like?
I don't particularly follow an exact schedule every day, but let's say that I'm making up let's say I'm making up a prototypical day. So I would get up maybe at kind of early, let's say 5:30 or 6, and then start working on my manuscript. And typically I print out what I'm working on, like from the day before or the week before or whatever. And so I might print out 50 or 100 pages or something, and then start reviewing the story. And I write standing up, so I'll be at my desk and then reviewing it, trying to analyze where things might go, because I write organically. I don't outline or plot anything out. And so I'm trying to kind of fill out where the story might go, where the emphasis is. Then I write my notes as I do, and then I type all those up and print it out again and chomp away at it. And if I can get 5 hours in by 1 o'clock, that's really legit for me. Then I usually need a break by then for sure. So maybe I'll go on a walk, exercise, play basketball, get outside, hike, something.
Perfect.
Then I love to get back for another hour or two kind of at night, after dinner, like to kind of play with some new ideas again. So an ideal day might be 5 hours in the morning, and then, a couple 2 hours at night would be a great day of writing for me. Perfect. And a couple pots of coffee in there as well.
Right. Always need the caffeine, right? Completely get that. Yeah. So do you write more than one project at the same time? So like you do like the first 5 hours, is that on one project? And then that one later where you're kind of like playing around with ideas, it's a new project, or ideas within that same story that you
well, basically when you start making a living writing or writing full time or whatever you want to call it, Basically what happens is you might be working on a project and then suddenly get an email back from your publisher on a previous thing. Oh, this needs to be proofread or edited or something like that. So then you got to shift your brain, go back, look at this, relook at this book for a day or two or whatever, then get back to the one that you're working on. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is an interesting thing. I have an idea for a new story. So, I kind of wish that I could just dive into something for 3 or 4 months, just only work on one, thing and just chomp away at it for 6 months or whatever. But it just never seems to work that way. So it's more like a stovetop where you have 3 or 4 things on the stovetop at the same time, and you kind of pull one to the front and mix it for a while. And then something in the back is simmering, so you switch it around, and then eventually you have something.
Right. Yeah. There you go. That's a really cool analogy. And do you have any productivity tips and tricks that you think all writers should have in place just to make their job easier telling their stories?
Okay, let's see. A few things come to mind now. First of all, I don't go by word count each day. I feel like I've tried that. Like one day I was like, I want to see how many words I can write, literally in 10 hours or whatever. I was like, I'm just going to write as many words. And I got like 6,000 words written. And I was like, this is amazing. I'll be done with my book in a week and a half. Like why haven't I done this before? So the next day I went back to it. And at the end of 10 hours, the next day, I had one more word written. Oh. So I literally went from 6,000 to 6,001.
Okay.
And because like I would change stuff, edit stuff, delete stuff, whatever. And I was like, I can't do that. This is too depressing. So I started to go by actually time. So I would say I'm going to work for 5 hours or 2 or 3 or whatever hours this day. That actually helps me at the end of the day. I can say, okay, look, I'm 5 hours closer to finishing my book rather than I only wrote 1 word today. Or less than a word. I wrote a half a word today. So that's one thing. I think that printing out your product, your book, and basically hand kind of going through and editing it saves tons of time and will allow you to see things that on the computer screen you just don't notice. Like the research is pretty clear that the more you compose on a keyboard, basically you'll write usually faster, but it won't be as good. Okay. And so you'll need to go through more drafts to really make it good. So I just figure like I need as much help as possible. So if that's the case, I'm going to do more, not necessarily handwriting the whole story, but working off from a page like that. We just tend to notice more and stuff. So, and then I do suggest basically setting time aside if possible, but life gets in the way. Like you might say, oh, I'm going to write every day from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. That's great. Well, and suddenly your kid gets sick and you're like, well, I can't, because then you get depressed and down. Oh, I didn't write yesterday. I got to write for 4 hours today or whatever. So life just is life. And so set the priority to write, but realize that there will be things that are higher priority, and that's okay. And so don't beat yourself up, about missing a day or whatever, and just kind of take a deep breath and dive in and move forward.
That's great advice. So I like to ask this question of all the writers and everyone that I've interviewed. So it's kind of a 2-part question, but what is the hardest or most difficult thing for you as a writer?
The hardest thing for me is actually working. This is going to sound bad. Working with editors tends to be frustrating for me. Not always. Yeah. Or when someone will give you a deadline. Like I've had deadlines where someone's like, we need this book by whatever day. Okay. Literally I'll stay up all night, finish, edit, write, edit, send it in. I about die. And one time I did that, and it was, so 3 months later, I called him. I was like, we're hoping to get to it this week. I'm like, what? Are you even kidding me?
Oh no.
Why did I spend 20 hours a day working on that when you didn't even look at it for 3 months? So that kind of stuff. Right. It just it's so frustrating.
I can imagine. I can imagine it would just make you want to, Oh my goodness.
So yeah,
I
but
can see how that would be very annoying.
the other thing is, like, I really love telling stories. Like, I feel like that's what I'm good at. It's telling stories and not marketing. And
Mm,
things have changed so much over the last decade where publishers don't really look at it as their job to market anymore. They look at it as the author's job to market. I'm
okay.
like, first of all, I'm not good at it. I don't understand it. It's not in my wheelhouse, and I don't enjoy it. Why would you ask me to be the one to market
Right.
when, like, I have no skills in that area? Like, it's not my thing. Why would you ask me to do that?
Yeah.
Because it's less work for them, and stuff.
Right. Right.
But so yeah, things have definitely shifted in that direction. And that again is just like, it's just not my thing to market. I'm
Right.
not a salesman. I'm just a writer and storyteller.
Right.
So yeah, yeah.
And I think, I don't know, but like I've heard some writers say that like many years ago, they used to do more marketing than they do
Publishers.
now. Yeah,
Oh
publishers,
yeah,
traditional publishers did
yeah.
like a lot back then, but nowadays they're kind of not doing as much. Is that something you've kind of noticed too?
Yeah, I mean, they don't tend to do as much, but I would not be an expert on self-publishing, because if you
Mhm.
self-publish, of course you have to self-market. So
Yeah.
it would just mean more hours, of marketing.
Yeah.
But all I love to do is just tell stories. And so as long as people will allow me to tell my stories,
Right.
I am more than happy.
You're
So
happy
yeah,
then. That's good. Perfect, which is a good segue into the next part of the question.
yeah.
What is the most precious thing that you love about doing what you do as a writer, storyteller? What is the most precious thing to you?
I mean, um, just the idea that I'm going to I'm going to try and entertain people. Clearly, I want them to enjoy the stories, but just the idea that I can hopefully help them to ask big questions as well is pretty amazing to me. Like, that someone would sit down and basically spend 10 hours of their life with me reading my book, to be entertained, certainly, but hopefully to deepen their experience with life. That is an honor.
Yeah.
And I really take it pretty seriously. I remember I heard a story by an author, a friend of mine, Davis Bunn. T. Davis Bunn is, but he writes under Davis, I think, at these
Okay.
times. But anyway, Davis Bunn. But he told me that when his first book came out, he went to a book signing, and there was this famous author next to him, and it was his first book, so he had like no one in line. But this famous author had this huge line of people wanting to sign the book. So he's just sitting there like, hello, I wrote a book as well, right here, next 5 feet away. You could buy my book. No one's in line. So I'm like, okay, I've been there, I get it. But he said this lady came walking up with, I think she was Brethren or Mennonite, had kind of a bonnet, a
Okay.
prayer bonnet thing or something. And she's carrying this book very reverently. She came up to him and she said, sir, is this a worthy book? And he's like, yes, it's a worthy book.
Mm,
And she said, would you kindly sign it for me, please? And I remember hearing that story from Davis, saying to myself, I want to be able to say yes. If someone were to come up to me anywhere and hold one of my books and say, is this a worthy book? To be able to look them in the eye and say, yes. It might
wow.
not be your cup of tea. Maybe you don't like suspense, thrillers, whatever. You like rom-coms or something. That's fine.
Yeah.
No problem with that. It might not be exactly up your alley, but yes, it is a worthy book. It's the
Worthy book.
best that I had to offer the
Nice.
world in my life. And so I actually have a sign in my office that says rage against mediocrity. So in my life, that's really, even if it takes me like a extra month or two to write a book,
Mm,
I want it to be that kind of book where I could look at someone and say yes.
no, that's cool.
And so yeah, so I love that, and I'm honored and humbled by the idea that I can be in that place to
Yeah.
tell stories.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big question. Like, is this a worthy book? And it's like, that's
Yeah,
even something that, while we're writing books, we can be thinking, okay, is this worthy? Is this worthy? That's such a
mm,
cool way to think about
yeah,
it and everything. So thank you
yeah.
for sharing that story and everything. I love hearing things like that. So good. Perfect. And then let's see here. Okay, and any last minute advice for writers who want to do this as a living?
It'll take a sacrifice to do any dream worth pursuing requires sacrifices. I would say for the most part, so, you just have to decide, am I going to give up an hour of television, social media, whatever it is today and work on my book?
Mhm,
Most people won't, which is fine. They've just made a decision that they don't want to spend that extra time
mhm.
doing it. But I'll meet a lot of people who come up to me and say, I want to write a story. I want to write a book. And I know most of them won't end up finishing it
Mhm.
because other stuff will get in the way. And um, so my encouragement would be, choose your priorities, whatever those might be. If your priority, usually you can tell what someone's priorities are by looking at their calendar. Someone
Oh.
once told me, you look at their calendar and their checkbook and you'll know what matters to people. And so yeah, so if you make the time for it, you can
Mhm.
pursue it, and it takes a lot of work, but it's not for everyone, and that's okay. But if you probably can't expect things to start selling and going crazy stuff if you're not putting in, you know, that
That
effort
time. Yeah.
beforehand. So just decide and then pursue it. If it's for you, say, okay, here we go.
Mhm.
And I tell people sometimes this sounds counterintuitive, and you might laugh when I say this, but one of the first things I think you need to do if you're going to be a successful writer is to quit your day job. Now, most people will say, don't quit your day job.
Yep.
Whatever you do, don't quit your day job. Well, there's two reasons I say that. Now, first is if you have to sell your stuff because you have to buy groceries, it'll motivate you to actually do
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
But secondly, and more importantly, is I don't necessarily mean you can't do anything else to make money. That's not what I'm, but in your mind, you have to say, okay, yes, I teach, or I sell octopus meat to pay the bills, or I sell lipstick door to door, whatever I do. But if you ask me what I do, I'm a writer.
Yeah.
And so, like in your mind, it's a shift in your mind of saying, instead of saying, I'm a teacher, I sell octopus, I sell makeup, whatever. Oh, and
Mhm.
then I write in my spare time. You have to make a switch where you're like, I'm a writer. Yeah, I do other stuff as necessary to pay the bills. But if you ask me what I do, that's who I am. Because, and you know this too, like every day offers us only a few super amazing hours of productivity. Most people work 8 or 10 hours, some of it's checking the email, some of it's at the water cooler or whatever.
Mhm.
But there are a few hours that all of us have. What are you going to do with those hours? I
Mm.
would say, right, if that's your passion, and
Yep.
then do other stuff to fill in as you have to. Um, so make the sacrifices necessary, make the decision to either pursue it or don't.
Mhm.
But whatever you do, don't expect things to necessarily, don't expect to be half-hearted about it and then find amazing success, because that doesn't happen to
Mhm.
most people.
Okay. Yep. That's great advice. Yeah. So where can people find you? So online
Yeah.
and your
I
books.
mean, most things Stephen James are at stephenjames.net, Stephen with a V. And so I'm on social media, like, how much I love social media now, but at Read Stephen James on some of the different social sites. So if you look for Read Stephen James, you can find me and message me through those, or check out my new books at stephenjames.net. And you can get the books wherever you buy books. It's all
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Wonderful. And then you have a podcast too, correct?
Yes, we have one called the Story Blender, and you can find out about it by searching for the Story Blender or going to thestoryblender.com. And
Perfect.
yeah, and so I interview some of the best-selling writers and storytellers in the world every week.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Stephen James. It was wonderful and had a great conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.